Drop in your technical questions and those will be answered by your trainer. Now, I would like to turn today's event to your presenter. Tim,
What we're concerned with in session 3 of 4 is the AZ900 objective domain called Security, Privacy, Compliance, and Trust with Microsoft Azure. And because I insist that my instruction flow, I want to make sure to integrate everything we've learned thus far in sessions 1 and 2. We're going to carry it forward, and this time look through our Azure implementation through the lens of these attributes here, security and so forth. First of all, a little review on security. I'd mentioned this briefly yesterday when we talked about networking, particularly with VMs, virtual machines, because you as a customer are responsible for securing your environment. Remember the shared responsibility model of cloud computing. Microsoft gives you the tools, but it's up to you as a customer to use them. One relatively new Azure product that Microsoft has is called Azure Firewall. A firewall is hardware or software device that will screen traffic coming through it and will either grant or deny access based on your rule set. And we saw, let me jump ahead just a second, a couple slides right here. We saw in session 2 a bit on network security groups. Remember, with virtual machines that are placed on a virtual network, the virtual machine has a network interface card which has its IP addresses, and then you protect access to the VM by associating it with an NSG. An NSG is also a filter, but it's a much more basic filter because you're just creating access lists based on protocols and IP addresses and ports. So that's relatively basic. For instance, you might say, well, this is a Linux virtual machine, and I do want my administrators to be able to use Secure Shell or SSH to connect to the VM. So I happen to know that that service listens on TCP port 22. So we would have an NSG rule that allows access to TCP/22 only from particular locations. You see what I'm saying? But NSGs may not provide enough security for a business, so there's a couple other Microsoft products that I need you to know about for your exam success. And one is Azure Firewall, which is effectively a software appliance that you plop on your virtual network. And it gives you much higher security because the Azure Firewall is able to inspect traffic much more deeply than just an NSG. In other words, an NSG will just look at IP addresses and ports, but a firewall will look and see what kind of application that traffic deals with. Oh, okay, so I see this as TCP/22, and I also see that's an SSH, and I also see these keys, so it's able to be much more robust about how it screens traffic. Another service that Microsoft offers in Azure is called Distributed Denial of Service Protection, or DDoS. A distributed denial of service is normally undertaken by bad actors to take a public, normally a high-profile website offline. In the news, I noticed last week, I think it was, this is when I'm teaching you today, it's mid-August 2019, Cloudflare, one of the world's biggest DDoS protection companies, itself was DDoSed, which isn't particularly good news. But DDoS protection is used to protect your Azure resources that use public IP addresses from getting flooded and knocked offline. So there's a basic level, a free level of protection, and there's a premium level of protection as well. As it says in the middle of this slide, the basic tier is automatically enabled. You don't even have to do anything. It's nice that Microsoft does that for us. I don't think we need to worry about ASGs. Defense in depth is an important security model where you take a layered approach to information security. You're starting at the physical level outside, and then gradually you get down to the core, which is data. Now in Azure, physical doesn't really come into play because we're never going to visit an Azure data center, but everything else in this, identity, perimeter would be your virtual network, compute would be your VMs or your platform services, your applications, and ultimately your data. And there's different things you can do. That doesn't sound particularly technical, does it? There's different actions you can take, features you can enable to better secure your resources in Azure. So it's a question of choosing what Azure products fit at which level as you're protecting your resources. At the perimeter on this slide, we've got features like I just told you about, the Ddos Protection and the Azure Firewall. In your virtual networks, the main line of defense is a network security group, and then you can extend it from there. Okay, so then we get into identity as well. So let's take a look in this next phase of our fundamentals training at security and identity, and then we'll move seamlessly into monitoring. Okay, so security and identity, let's actually consider them both. What if we want to give certain staff members the ability to manage virtual machines, but we don't want those people to have access elsewhere in the environment? Let's say in particular, let's make this really real world. We've got a colleague named Jason, and we want to put him on VM management, but we want to make sure that he can't inadvertently or intentionally go elsewhere and maybe start messing with databases or other things. We want to keep him penned in. Of course, we trust our employees, but we also want least privileged security, and we also may have security controls that we need to document for compliance purposes. How role-based access control security is normally done is at the resource group level. So we can choose the resource group that we want to secure, like let's say AZ900 training. And we can go to access control IAM. And first we can check the access of a particular user in our subscription. Remember that the identity store in our Azure subscription is called Azure Active Directory, or Azure AD. And I have a fictional user in my directory called Jason, at least one actually. I'll choose Jason Reader. And what we can do here is report on any role assignments he has right now. And it looks like he has no access. So that means if I open up an in-private window, and let's pretend that we're Jason, and we're going to log into the Azure portal. So we'll put in Jason's Azure Active Directory user ID. Hopefully I'll remember his password. I have multi-factor authentication installed for this account, so it's asking for an approval. However, I don't have access to that right now. So let me choose to sign in another way. And I'm going to send a text message to my mobile phone. This MFA is something I hope that you're already familiar with, and I hope you're using it in your life. Multi-factor authentication, now more than ever before, is super important. And by the way, MFA is something you can do directly from within Azure Active Directory. So anyway, as you can see in the upper right corner, we're logged in as Jason. To tie in from our session 1 learning, I said that each user gets their own portal. So notice that it's defaulted to the home screen, but we can switch over to dashboard if we want to. Now, if we go to resource groups, what will we see? We're going to see any resource groups that Jason has access to. It looks like right now he's been given some kind of access to Contoso. I don't know what level of access. We'll have to drill in here and see. Yeah, it looks like he can't delete the resource group. So again, this is an illustration of role-based access control in action, where your goal is to make sure that your different Azure users, your administrators, your developers, and so forth have only their required level of access, but nothing more. Because Jason isn't yet on the access control list for our AZ900 training resource group, it simply doesn't show up. It's invisible to Jason's environment here in resource groups, you see? That's by design. So back in our administrative session here, let's add in a role assignment for Jason. And we've got a whole bunch of built-in roles that Microsoft gives us. The 3 most popular are owner, contributor, and reader. Owner, you want to be very careful with. That's the top tier. You can do anything, including modify the access. Contributor is almost as powerful as owner. It's to do everything but modify access. And reader is just view only. Now, also, if we scroll down, there's a number of service-specific roles, virtual machine roles, where we can really scope down what Jason can do. And when you hover over the little I, it gives you some additional details. So if we gave Jason membership to the virtual machine contributor role, it says lets you manage VMs, but not access to them and not the virtual network or storage account that they're connected to. So we would have to make assignments elsewhere if Jason needed to modify the virtual network or the storage account. I'm going to choose that actually for his role. And we can look him up again just by doing a search in our list here. We're searching our Active Directory tenant. And we'll save that change. And now if we go over to role assignments, let me minimize this. We can see a list of different role holders and different users who are in there. And we can see down at the very bottom that Jason's been given security access to this resource group. Now, the fact that he's got access to the resource group means that this role membership cascades to anything inside the resource group. So that means if we go back into AZ900 training and we go check out, say, the VM, I mean, there's a lot more than just the VM, as you can see here. There's the Cosmos we created in the previous session, the storage account. If we go to the storage account, for instance, and we go to Access Control IAM, let's quickly check Jason's access here. Should Jason have any access here? What do you think? Well, he's got virtual machine contributor, but he shouldn't have access to the storage account, and he certainly shouldn't have access to Cosmos. But what I'm saying is, by doing your security at the resource group level, it saves you time and effort because those permissions cascade to all of the resources within the resource group. So let's go back, and I'm going to control refresh to see if it picks up his new access. I don't know if it will. We may have to relog in. Yeah. So we're going to have to, let's sign out and sign back in as Jason to refresh his access token. Yep. And I will come to resource groups. Yep. And so now we have AZ900 training. And if we look at the resources in this group, everything that's in the resource group is at least visible. If we go to the AZ900 VM, remember, we've given him virtual machine contributors, so he should be able to manage this VM, including doing something like stopping it. So let's do this. Stop this virtual machine. And it looks like it's going through, so he does have that permission. Now, what if he wanted to do something with the virtual network that the virtual machine exists on? I can do a search up in the top of the portal for VNet and select the virtual network service. And we can actually filter the view here to show only the AZ900 resource group. So we've got only one virtual network that VM is living on. We can come in here, we can view it as a virtual machine contributor, but if we try to make a change, let me try to add a subnet. Don't worry about what a subnet is for our purposes. It's just a portion of the virtual network. Let's call this data, and let's say that its address range is 10.0.1.0/24. Well, why isn't it accepting that? I don't know what the address space is. Sorry about this. I have to quickly check this. Oh, so it's 10.0.0.20. Nuts. That's too bad. Well, anyway, I'm demonstrating this here. Let me try to remove this address space. What I want to do is do a sanity check to prove that role-based access control is kicking in, that Jason can stop the virtual machine that you see in the notification window, but we're unable to commit a change elsewhere. Like it looked like it deleted that address space, but it's not going to save the change because Jason doesn't have privilege to do that based on his access. Does that make sense, I hope? So you're going to find that role-based access control goes across all resources. Now, Jason's not seeing anything in app services because, well, although he should actually, but he's got virtual machine contributors. So Azure is smart enough to actually hide the web app that we created in the previous session. All right, hopefully you've got the general idea. And again, just to repeat, that access control IAM is always going to be there. So you can always come in and it has the same interface where you can check access for any user to do a sanity check. You can view and edit role assignments. You can make additions. It's the same paradigm. But all of those accounts, those Azure AD accounts, exist in your Azure Active Directory. So let's take a look at that next. If we do a search for Azure Active Directory, it'll take us in there. This is an identity store that's associated with your Azure subscription. And if we go under Manage Users, we will see a list of user accounts that I've created. Now, this would just have one account initially. When you create a subscription, you'll have just the one account. That's the identity that you use to create the subscription. And then from there, you can populate your Azure Active Directory however you want to. I'm not sure how deep down the rabbit hole we get on AZ900 with that. Let me see. I wondered if it was going to get into the different types of Azure Active Directory. It looks like it doesn't. It looks like we need to understand the difference between authentication and authorization, and I'm going to make sure that you understand Azure multi-factor authentication. Here's the idea. Your Azure Active Directory will be populated with your administrators and your developers and the people who are working on your Azure-based services. Technically, you can also use your Azure Active Directory instance to host your customers. Remember in session 1 when I created an app service app? Let me open the shortcut and go to All Services. And let me bring out a shortcut to App Services just to make it easier so I don't have to keep searching for it. Remember this? I'm going to select the little star, and then I'm going to drag this guy up so it's more in my view. And let's say that we developed a line of business SaaS, software as a service. Remember that from session 1, application. And let's say that's what this is. And we're going to sell access to the general public. And maybe that app has a system where the users are required to create an account. Where are you going to store their identity? Now, you could store it in your Azure Active Directory instance, but I would advise against that for many reasons. Security being not the least reason for which. You want a clear separation between your internal staff and your customers. So just if you're thinking along those lines, yeah, well, Tim, how would you accomplish that? A common case for this is to use what's called Azure AD B2c. Have you ever heard of that before? Azure AD B2c stands for Azure Active Directory Business to Consumer, and it's basically a portable version of Azure Active Directory. So you would use your main Azure Active Directory for your own staff. And then if you're doing SaaS app development and you want to isolate your customers in their own Azure AD, a nice alternative is to create an Azure AD B2c instance. And you know why? Not only will it keep your general public customers separated, but it will allow them to use their own social media logins. So instead of having to create a separate identity for your app, they can reuse their existing Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn credentials. That's all I want to say about Azure Active Directory B2C, but it's I think a really important, compelling point here. Okay, so we're looking at our Azure Active Directory, and these are our internal users. And you need to decide, for instance, what kind of policy you need to put on them. I mean, from a general standpoint, how does this work? When you create a new user, you provide that user with a friendly name and a username. The username, in my experience, it doesn't have to be an email address, but it's in the format of an email address. And one thing that you'll want to do in the real world with your Azure Active Directory is to associate your company's domain name with Azure AD so you can do something like this. As you see here, Devyani@timw.info. I own the timw.info DNS domain, and because I've added it to my Azure AD tenant, I'm able to use it as the user ID for my users. You see what I'm saying? The idea of groups allows you to put Azure AD users into these groups. You create the groups yourself, of course, and this allows you to make it easier to manage, just like on-premises. You know, if you're familiar with on-premises Active Directory administration, it's somewhat similar to that. Why is it not liking this? A username is the identifier that well, why didn't it like it? I am in the, username already exists in this directory. Oh, okay. Interesting. Well, you get the general idea. Creating a user in Azure Active Directory is a pretty straightforward operation. You can even invite users from out in the world, like if you're working with a contractor, for instance, and you don't want to create a permanent Azure AD account, you can invite the user to come in using their existing email ID. So Azure AD's got a lot going for it as far as that goes. Another thing that it's got going for it is MFA, or multi-factor authentication as it's called. MFA is where you're requiring your users, you're challenging them to provide some information that they have in addition to their password. And the main way to configure MFA in Azure Active Directory, I do it anyway, through the Users panel. There's a click out over here on the top menu called Multi-Factor. We don't need to go further down the rabbit hole with this, but the bottom line, what you need to know for Azure Fundamentals is that MFA is available in Azure Active Directory. It provides a second layer of security for your Azure AD users, so that if somebody were to guess Abby Brown's password, for instance, and try to log into her Azure resources with her ID, if you've got a policy where you're requiring an MFA challenge, maybe an SMS text message or a Microsoft Authenticator one-time token, in this case, Abby would be notified on her smartphone immediately, and if she realized that she didn't put in her password herself, but she's getting an MFA challenge, I hope that she would call the support desk immediately to report that as fraud. You see what I'm saying? So we've got that capability in Azure Active Directory natively, which is, I think, pretty darn cool. And as far as basic user management, you can do password reset, or you could allow your users to reset their passwords themselves. Beyond that, though, superficial stuff like that, I don't want you to get confused thinking that Azure Active Directory is the same thing as Active Directory domain services on-prem, because they're very different. The only thing they have in common is the fact that they're identity stores and that they have some of the same name, namely Active Directory. Other than that, they're quite different indeed. Okay. Other security services, there's Key Vault and information protection and threat protection. Sure. Okay. So what do we have there? Are you familiar with 1Password or LastPass or KeePass? Nowadays, the ideal is that you don't even know your own password. You're keeping a very strong and nearly impossible to guess password in a key vault. Well, Azure Key Vault is a cloud-based secrets repository. And the reason why developers and administrators like Azure Key Vault is that you can store secrets in it and then retrieve those secrets without ever having to expose the actual password. What do I mean by that? Well, let's tie in some of our learning from the previous couple of sessions. Let's go back to our storage account that we created in session 2. Again, I want to cut this down here. Let's use the filter to show only our AZ900 training resources. We created a general purpose V2 storage account called AZ900 Storage 704. Well, the way that you authenticate to this account, and that brings up the exam objective, authentication refers to credential validation. It refers to, is this identity allowed to do an action? Is Tim at timw.info allowed to come into the Azure portal? And that process of being challenged, let me open a new in private window and go to portal.azure.com and sign out. It looks like I was signed in as Jason already. This is authentication. Are you who you claim to be? And notice that I'm saying identity rather than user account, because once you get down into IT at a deeper level, you want to do authentication without having to type a password. And you also may want to authenticate things besides a user. Maybe you have in your application source code that needs to tap into this storage account. Your code isn't going to send a username and a password into the storage account. At least I hope it's not, to authenticate. Instead, you're going to programmatically do it. And that's what this is showing us here. For instance, with storage accounts, they're protected with 2 keys. Now that's what these long gobbledygook things are. And this allows you in your source code, in your application code, whatever that might be, to be able to authenticate, in other words, or to be allowed in to the storage account. These are, they're totally different values, but they're linked where you can use either key 1 or key 2. It doesn't matter. They're interchangeable. And there's a copy here that makes it easy to pull it out. And so you would put in your source code at most the key value. And then when the code needs to come into storage, it would hand in the name of the storage account and the key. Azure would see that and say, yep, you're allowed in. So you've been authenticated. Now, authorization is what you can do once you're authenticated, and that ties into role-based access control, what we talked about here. You see what I'm saying? So authentication and authorization are different, but they both support the same thing. So anyway, how does this tie into Key Vault? Some developers don't even want to put the key in their source code because honestly, if you know the name of my storage account and you were to copy this entire key value, you could authenticate right now into my AZ900 storage account. Now you can try that, but by the time you're trying it, I've already deleted this because when I teach a class, I torch all of my resources as soon as I'm finished. But that represents a possible security problem. Also, notice that there's key 1 and key 2, and see these little regenerate buttons? It's good security practice to periodically roll over or regenerate your keys so that you don't have a single key staying out in the wild for too long. You see what I'm saying? Now, what if you have multiple storage accounts with multiple keys, and you've got different Azure products and services? You've got app service apps, you've got Azure VMs, you've got Azure SQL, you've got all these services, and maybe they need to interact with the storage account programmatically. If you use a key in the source code and then you regenerate the key, now you've got to go back and refactor your source code and update the key value. Yeah, that's not fun to do once, but to do that regularly for multiple accounts is awful. So an example of Key Vault integration is that you can store your storage account keys in Key Vault, and that way, even when you change your keys, when you regenerate them, because you're referencing the secret in Key Vault and not the underlying key, you never have to change your code. You see? Now, how to do that? It looks like that process of going to Key Vault-based storage is something you can't do in the portal. We could quickly look up, for instance, Azure Storage Account Use Key Vault Docs. Just look for what you're looking for and add docs to the end of it. And chances are you're going to find a step-by-step tutorial on how to do it. You see what I mean? And it looks like if we go down to the tutorial section, you can use either PowerShell or Azure CLI to do that, to create what's called an Azure Key Vault Managed storage account. That brings up the important point that not every Azure feature is available in the Azure portal. There are some things, many things actually, that you have to do programmatically using either Azure PowerShell or Azure CLI. Now, to tie that into our learning in session 1, remember I said that you've got the Cloud Shell always available to you here in the Azure portal, and that's absolutely true, as you see here. It's going to pop us in here, it's going to authenticate us to use authentication, and it's going to give us the level of access to our subscription or authorization that we have via that access control IAM stuff that we were looking at a moment ago. You see what I'm saying? Now, it says in the Cloud Shell to type AZ to use the CLI. Whether you use PowerShell, if I type PWSH, it kicks off Azure PowerShell. Whether to use that to manage Azure or the CLI, it's literally going to be just your preference. I have some friends that love the Azure command line interface. They say it's a lot more intuitive and faster than PowerShell. And then I have friends that have been using PowerShell for a while and who prefer to use that. So it's largely your choice, and you find that the documentation will oftentimes give you docs articles for both methods to accommodate folks with the different preference levels. You see, now one little bit about Azure CLI that I'm going to show you now is that if you type AZ Interactive in Cloud Shell, it takes you into the what's called the Azure Interactive environment. And I like this because once it activates anyway, it says loading down at the bottom. It gives you help as you type the AZ command. So this is why I think Azure command line interface is especially attractive to newcomers, because instead of having to know PowerShell first and then Azure PowerShell second, the AZ environment, the Azure CLI, especially when you're using the interactive shell that I'm in right now, it actually takes you by the hand and helps you discover the commands. And then eventually you'll be flying through here, making and editing and deleting resources. It's kind of seems to be a little stuck here on my system here. Let me clear the screen. Here we go. So as we're typing, I can just tab through here. And I'm just typing a couple letters and pressing tab. So AZ account list, we can see, we don't even have to be told what this means. Down in the middle of the screen, get a list of subscriptions for the currently logged in accounts. And we can do -- all, and we get our results here. Now the results come back in JavaScript object notation or JSON, which isn't particularly user-friendly, but I can up arrow and I can do -O tab and say, show me this as a table instead. You see what I mean? So that's Azure CLI. You just need to be aware that it exists, that it's an alternative to PowerShell, all right? And also the fact that there are many tasks in Azure that you have to do programmatically. So really, I want to stress that if you're going to do any appreciable amount of work in Azure, it's required, in my humble opinion, that you know how to do the work not only in the Azure portal, but you should choose Azure PowerShell and or Azure CLI and get up to speed with those ASAP. Cool. What else do we got here? Policies, initiatives, locks. Okay, yeah, that's some good stuff as well. Keeping on this theme of identity, access, authentication, authorization. The resource lock can be pretty darn useful, actually. Let me go to resource groups and let me show you what we're talking about here. Okay, so we've got our AZ900 training, right? And we've got a couple resources in it, quite a bit, actually. We've deployed some databases, a VNet, we've got a bunch of stuff. What if we want to protect these against accidental deletion? You might think, well, shouldn't your administrators be careful? Yes, but you know human nature. Really neat little thing you can do here is add what are called resource locks. It shows up for a resource in the settings list. You can add it at, say, the resource group level, and the lock will cascade down to all resources inside the resource group. Or if you just want to add a lock to a particular resource, you can do that as well, like this app service plan, for instance. I can filter the settings list and look at locks right there. Now, the lock is not a strong authorization like the access control is. If you assign somebody to a role, they can only do that stuff. But if you don't have them on the access list, they don't even see that the resource exists. You see what I mean? Locks is meant to be an additional layer of security that adds kind of a sanity check. It prevents human error. So on the resource group, I'm going to go to add lock, and I'm going to call this, let's see, there's two kinds of locks. There's read only and delete. Read only is not going to allow any configuration changes, so it's a much stricter lock. I'm going to choose just protect against deletions. I'll call this RG for resource group, delete lock. And I'm going to click OK. Okay, cool. Now, I'm not sure if I'll have to regenerate my token. Just to be safe, I'm going to sign out and sign back in to make sure I've got a new token. I'm going to stay signed in. And so let's go to a resource in that resource group. And I'm going to use the filter controls here to look only at our AZ900 training. And let's go to our storage account that we know is in that group. Whoops. Fortunately, we've got a safety net, basically. It can't be deleted because this resource or its parent has a delete lock. Locks must be removed before the resource can be deleted. You see what I'm saying? So again, to repeat one final time, the lock isn't technically an authorization method. It's just a kind of a sanity check that you can prevent inadvertent changes or deletes to resources. Unfortunately, when you set a lock at a higher level and you need to override it at the granular level, you have to unlock the parent, at least temporarily. So in this case, it's saying the parent resource lock can't be edited here. Use the buttons above to go there. And in this case, I know that it's a resource group level lock. So we'll click resource group. It brings us to management locks. And unfortunately, it looks like we're going to have to recreate the lock when we want to re-add it. But now if we wanted to go back to AZ900 Storage 704, back to the overview page, I'm not going to do so, but I could delete this if I wanted to. Again, to tie in our learning from sessions 1 and session 2, remember that the storage account allows us to browse the services directly from within Storage Explorer. And remember also that when we created that AZ900 VM, one of the setup steps was to whether you wanted to enable diagnostics monitoring on the VM, and I chose yes. And if you choose yes, you have to choose a storage account. And that now we can see that AZ900 VM1 has been sending its diagnostics data into a blob container called boot diagnostics AZ900 VM1. And it looks like it's created a serial console log and a screenshot. Now, what's that? Let's right-click that screenshot. The screenshot is kind of, again, I'm using the term sanity check a lot, but it's a way to see that the virtual machine is okay, that it's not in a blue screen or crashed state. So this is what the VM looks like, at least the last time Diagnostics took a picture. And when was that? That was at 9:23 my local time. As you can see, I'm trying to gently and smoothly transition us into monitoring, which is another exam objective. Well, on my clock, I'm almost at 10 a.m. So I'm seeing, why is this out of date? Is that VM in an okay state? How could I monitor my VMs to make sure that it hasn't shut down or something? How can I monitor my environment? Hint, the central hub for monitoring not only VMs, but your entire Azure infrastructure is Azure Monitor. So let's go there next. The overview page looks like it's just help. I want to drill in to start by going to activity log. Now, activity log ties in not only to monitoring, but also keeping up with our security and identity piece too, because remember I mentioned in a previous session that Azure never leaves any action to the imagination. It logs every single action. The activity log in particular logs every administrative action that happens. And it does so at such a granular level, you may not even care. Some things in this list will be immediately obvious. The most recent thing that I recognize is this one here, 2 minutes ago, tim@timw.info. At this particular time and date stamp, you can expand the columns here if you want. Excuse me, it deleted the management lock, you see? And you know, because you were there when we did that. But it can get a bit noisy here because there's a lot of events that are initiated by Azure itself that you may not care about. So when you want to quickly figure out what happened, who did what when, you'll want to start using some of these filters. You see what I'm saying? And I can just do a free text filter as well. AZ900 VM, let's just try that. And there was a health event updated. That's not really helping. Let's try to go into these filters here. Let's filter our subscriptions to look only at our sponsorship subscription. Our time span, it goes to 6 hours. Event severity, all. Let's add another filter and say, let's look at a resource and it's going to be AZ900 VM, right? If I can find it. I can get kind of lost in the filter list. What I'm trying to do here is drill down a bit more to find the status of that VM. I'm a little bit clumsy, as you can see here on the activity log. This is something I haven't used yet when I'm hovering over Quick Insights. Let's actually click and learn this together. It looks like this just gives you a roll-up of errors, failed deployments, alerts, health, and role assignments that happened over the last 24 hours. So it looks like Microsoft added this recently as a way to see what they consider to be some of the most important events. So let's go to role assignments and see what it's saying. So 30 minutes ago was when we created a role assignment, and it looks like we gave Jason Reeder virtual machine contributor. And again, you were there for that, so you remember that operation. Okay, so activity log shows you what are called control plane events. You can download these reports as a comma-separated value format. Metrics is where you can tap into your resources and plot stuff. Before we do that, though, it's bothering me about the status of the VM. So rather than monitor, what I would do if I was working in the real world right now, I would just go to virtual machines and look up the VM directly and see what its status is. And we can see that it's stopped. And of course, I knew this because we stopped it as in a previous demo, didn't we? So we can select it and start it directly from here. And as you remember, we've got our notifications up above. Each Azure resource has its own section for monitoring and diagnostics. It's normally down towards the bottom. And specifically for VMs, if you go into Diagnostic Settings, you can choose more granularly or less granularly the kind of metrics that you want to collect from the virtual machine. So a VM, of course, you've got CPU and memory and disk, and those are collected by default. Log files that exist on the VM. So here you're deciding what kind of telemetry, as it's called, or diagnostics and information data that you want to come out of the virtual machine. Here's that screenshot. It's called boot diagnostics, by the way, when periodically Azure will take a picture of the screenshot of the machine. And this diagnostics actually stretches to infrastructure as a service as well. So for our app services, remember this, that hosted web application that we created? If we scroll down towards the bottom, there's a lot of settings in here, as you can see. We've got alerts, metrics, app service logs, and lots of different kinds of logs you can turn on and you can turn off for your platform as a service services. You can even, with platform as a service, a lot of times you can connect to a log stream. So in other words, as the underlying VM is emitting events, it can kick them right into the screen where you can watch them as they're happening live directly in the Azure portal. Kind of cool. So like I'm saying, the specific kind of monitoring options you can configure at a per resource level. But to come back to that monitor tool, Azure Monitor, one thing that I love about this is that it attempts to centralize your monitoring. So instead of having to go to 10 VMs, let's say you want to monitor your public IP addresses. You know, that distributed denial of service protection that we talked about earlier? How can you get to that stuff without having to try to track down? You can always go to the public IP addresses blade. That's tracked as a separate resource in Azure. But thinking in terms of more centralized monitoring and management, we've got Azure Monitor. And if we come down under Diagnostic Settings here, it gives you everything, doesn't it? And not only that, it tells you whether diagnostics are even enabled or not for that resource. So here I have a public IP that's creatively called public IP. And if I want to catch diagnostics and monitor this, I'll want to enable it. So to enable it here in the portal, I can add a diagnostic setting, and I'll call this public IP diagnostics. And you can save the diagnostics in a number of different spots, including a storage account. And yes, we can use that, we can reuse that storage account that we created earlier. But it looks like in this case, my public IP, although it's in the same region, oh, here it is. Yeah, I was thinking it should show us the AZ900 storage account that we created, and sure enough, there it is. Yeah, so we can bring that data in here, and then of course we have to choose what logs or what metrics we want to include in our diagnostics. And if you're thinking, Tim, my gosh, it's going to take you 2 hours in Azure Monitor to go through all of those different resources, and that's true if we were to do this manually. But that, again, is where the power of programmatic access comes in. Cloud Shell or using Azure PowerShell or the Azure CLI. This is why it's so important. If you're going to do a lot of work with Azure, particularly as an administrator, you'll want to learn PowerShell because you can do something like what I would do, for instance, if I needed to enable diagnostics on a bunch of IP addresses, I would use, say, some kind of looping, some kind of for each loop that does the enablement and iterates through all of the resources. And I could write a single script that could do the same thing for all of these that you see on the screen. And then once the script is written, you can just rerun the script whenever you need to. You see, it's one of the beauties of administrative automation, as it's called. Okay, so anyway, let's come back up to the top in Azure Monitor and let's do some metrics. Metrics is good is when you want quantitative feedback. Okay, I'm getting service desk tickets that our web application is really slow. Okay, well, how utilized is the VM that's running the web app or our Azure App Service? What are the requests per second? Are we getting HTTP errors, you see? So monitor metrics allow you to plot that information. Let's do that right now. Let's browse our subscription. In this case, we're in sponsorship. Our resource group is, I might have to scroll out a little bit, is AZ900 training. Our resource type, let's go into VM. Let's come up to the top and deselect select all and come down to the bottom and select virtual machines. So we're just gradually drilling our way in, aren't we? I'm going to have to scroll out to see it. And then let's select our AZ900 VM. Okay, what kind of metric do you want to look at here? And there's a number of metrics that you can choose from. The list here is going to depend upon whether you've enabled diagnostics for the resource or not. This isn't going to be too useful because the VM's been quiet, but at least you get the general idea. And then we choose an aggregation. So this is showing percent CPU. And we can adjust the time scale here. Let me see, chart settings. You can choose the chart type. You can change the title. I'm going to call, yeah, that looks pretty good, actually. Average percentage CPU for AZ900 VM. We can change the Y and X axis ranges, so on. I was looking for changing the scale to show more than just the past 12 hours or whatever. I may be missing it. It may be in front. Oh, here it is. Last 24 hours. In this case, we don't need to change it because the VM hasn't been around that long. But this allows you to change the time range that you're looking at. You can create a new alert based on this. So you could say, for instance, if the CPU spikes to a certain threshold, run these scripts or send me an SMS message or do whatever. And we can also pin one of your metrics to the dashboard. I mentioned this in session 1. Let's go back to the dashboard. And now we have this chart that will be auto updating as time goes on. And so the idea is that you can put this on another monitor, for instance, and use it as a business intelligence dashboard. You can literally keep your eye on, in this case, the utilization of a particular VM. Now, those Azure VM metrics allow you to plot multiple things on the same. So we could have not only this VM, but other VMs, and their lines would be in different colors. I'm just trying to stress how you can go on from there, okay? Okay, it's now time for us to turn back to Azure.com because there's some important websites that you'll be tested on your Azure fundamentals, dealing more with compliance and reporting and that kind of stuff. I want to make sure you understand the Microsoft Trust Center. The Microsoft Trust Center is an entire website unto itself. And this is where you can go to read. There are some tools in here, but mostly it's just Microsoft demonstrating to you how they secure your data, security overview, privacy overview, data management. Go to privacy. Basically, for your exam success, I encourage you to spend a couple hours browsing the Trust Center and pay particular attention to what they call out here in the objectives. The Microsoft privacy statement, the Trust Center in general, the Service Trust Portal, which is another place. I'll put that in a different browser tab. Azure Compliance Manager, that's another site that you need to know about. And the way you'll be tested with this on your AZ900 is maybe your question will say, you need to review all of the service level agreements that Azure has. And the answers might be, do you use Azure Service Trust Portal? Do you use the Azure Compliance Manager tool? What do you do? So you need to know the general, what you can do at each site. And so at the Trust Center, that's where you've got all of Microsoft's privacy statements, their privacy principles, the fact that you own your data, all of the attestations under compliance. There's a whole lot here. All of the compliance regimes, for lack of a better term, that Microsoft supports. Because before going into Azure, your compliance department might be subject to one or another global or industry or service-related compliance regime. Let me just grab an industry one offhand. Health would be a good example. And let's see, whoops, global. Let me choose North America, health, Azure. And let me scroll out here. This should fill in, I thought. But basically, it allows you to drill into whatever compliance program you need to be compliant in Azure. And it shows you in great detail how Azure meets that compliance. And it also gives you a whole bunch of documentation on how you can certify in Azure. Okay. Now, you might think, well, gosh, that is going to require some work on my end. It's one thing to go into Trust Center and read about the different compliance offerings that Microsoft attests to, whether it's GDPR or in the US here, there's HIPAA and DSS and FedRAMP, etc. There's a lot to read through here. But like I said, to sum up, Trust Center is for the privacy statement and general compliance information. The Service Trust Portal is where you can actually get into some tools. This would be where your compliance department says, okay, we need to do our audit report for GDPR. We need to actually gather the data in Azure to verify that we're compliant. That's where the Service Trust Portal comes in, and in particular, a tool called Compliance Manager, okay? And I don't know how far we can get in here just using my Azure AD account. But this is actually a software as a service tool where you can go into a particular compliance, like GDPR, for instance, and it shows you line item by line item what's required, and you can fill it in and tap into your Azure subscriptions and attest to those and generate reports. Compliance is not my specialty, so that's why I literally can't go much deeper with you on that. But from an AZ900 standpoint, I'm going to repeat one final time to come. Let's use the exam objectives. You need to have just general familiarity with some of the most common compliance terms, GDPR, NIST, ISO. Understand the Trust Center, where you get the privacy statement and the compliance information, and the Service Trust Portal, where you get to that Compliance Manager tool, where you can actually have your compliance folks log in, complete the forms, and generate the reports directly from within that tool. It can hopefully save them a lot of time. You got it? So we've got 4 minutes left in our session. Let's see, sweep up the proverbial shavings here. Did locks, Azure Advisor, policies, information protection. Okay, all right. There's a number of machine learning platforms in Azure. Now, machine learning and artificial intelligence, you're thinking of where a computer is being trained to make predictions based on past behavior. So Azure Advisor is a free service that I think every Azure administrator, developer, architect needs to use. You can't beat the price. It's using those machine learning algorithms to give you feedback on how you can improve your availability, security, performance, and cost. And this is free. It's awesome. So security, it looks like in my environment, Advisor has one recommendation. It says secure transfer to storage accounts should be enabled, and that's impacting 2 of my storage accounts. This can be really useful, potentially business-saving information. So if you go into it, it actually gives you either instructions on how to remediate, or in some cases, Advisor will actually do the work for you, okay? So that's Advisor. There's another intelligence engine called Azure Security Center that has a whole bucket load of security-related tools. You'll recall that when we connected to our VM in session 2, we were using just-in-time VM access. This is a way to close all of your administrative ports unless that connection has been explicitly requested by an administrator. That's one of the many features in Azure Security Center, all right? As far as some of those other features, Azure policies and initiatives, those are ways to do Azure governance, where you can specify that your administrators and developers can only deploy to certain regions, they can only deploy VMs that are certain sizes. It's a way to save money and ensure that you're staying in compliance, basically. Information protection and advanced threat protection, again, deal with some of those machine learning services. Information protection allows you to do digital rights management, or DRM, where somebody can view a document from an Azure account, but they can't print or forward it. Advanced threat protection is kind of sort of like an antivirus scanner, but it uses Microsoft Threat Intelligence, which is, again, that machine learning, artificial intelligence stuff. And you can use that in conjunction with your servers or potentially even your desktop endpoint devices. Let's do a couple review questions and we will call session 3 finished. You're the VM administrator for your subscription. Multiple users can access 5 VMs. Users are complaining that 2 of them have shut down abruptly. You want to find which user did it. Is that Monitor, Firewall, Activity Log, or Ddos Protection? I think you know, don't you? Yep. Activity Log is in Azure Monitor, but it tells you who did what when. It doesn't tell why, but it says who, what, when, and how, I guess. You know, let me come back. One more thing about this. You notice that I could possibly make an argument that A is correct because Activity Log is part of Azure Monitor. You shouldn't see that kind of an issue on your live exam because Microsoft Learning has a lot of editing where they try to do everything they can to make sure that there's not ambiguity in the questions. And you can file a complaint to MS Learning if you do feel a question is unfair for whatever reason. Perhaps I'll show you that at the beginning of session 4. Okay, here we've got an increase of the number of resources that are deleted. How we apply a cannot delete lock on the subscription. Does that meet the requirement? In this case, no. So we do not want any changes to be done to the production subscription, and we apply a delete lock. Do you know why this doesn't meet the requirement? Remember that there are 2 locks. There's read only and delete. Delete lock allows you to do anything up to your level of authorization except delete. So that's the linchpin there. In closing, I want to remind you of Microsoft Learn, aka.ms/learn. In particular, you should be studying the Azure Fundamentals Learning Path. It's free, it's fun, it's awesome. I strongly recommend it. Also, visit the tiny URL link to get the hands-on lab guide. That's located at a GitHub repository. Thanks for your participation. I'll see you for session 4, in which we'll wrap up Azure Fundamentals with Azure pricing and support. Take good care.